Hi, everybody. This is Kent Rooker here from Noble 9, and I'm here with Barak Schoster. He's the co founder and CTO of BridgeCrew.io.
Hi, Kit. Great being here. Thank you for having me.
Well, I want to jump right into it because I know you're kind of a security guy, and there was this security breach recently with Twitter. I wanted to hear your take on that. Like, what happened?
Really, there are not a lot of details about it, but let's think about the impact. A lot of celebrities had their Twitter account hacked, and the attacker have published a Bitcoin wallet where a transfer can be made to, with a scam that the transfer money will later be donated back. The impact is huge because people like Elon Musk are talking about Bitcoin all of the time, and obviously they are the thought leaders in those areas. And when people understood that this is a hack, uh, I guess that everybody in Twitter got kind of panicked. You saw some tweets from the support, and my guess or my speculation is that it can be an MFA issue on the celebrity's account or some kind of misconfiguration or overprivileged access to one of the Twitter employees that got leaked.
So it sounds like it's a little early to tell the cause. I mean, you're talking a little bit about that. Are there any other financial disclosures or data breaches where we do know? I mean, that are maybe a little bit older that we do know what happened?
Yeah, so actually on 2019, there was a huge breach to Capital One. There is actually a very well documented FBI report from the Justice Department. One of the Capital One WAF servers that should have secured their cloud was actually misconfigured and overprivileged. And it was also outdated with patches. So actually what happened there is the result was a lot of credit card data was leaked out, and a lot of people were required to change their credit card number and get a new one. But the fact that it happened so easily was actually astonishing. A former AWS employee found out about their WAF server with vulnerability and overprivileged role, hacked into it, and enumerated a bunch of S3 buckets, and got out some unencrypted S3 data to her own laptop.
So there's actually a public FBI report. It'd be amazing to like walk through that. Have you looked at it?
All right. So if you go into the justice.gov, you'll get the actual FBI report. Most of it is not censored, with the scenario that happened, um, step by step, and how was it investigated and how they found out about the attacker. Actually, the attacker have published in some chats that they have all of this data, and they just like went into the police officer with their grenades on and say, "Hey, I have this bomb. Um, are you going to defuse it?" Obviously, she was caught quite fast. And one thing that is good to mention is that Capital One had a lot of auditing and logging in place that helped them identify the root cause and how the attacker have did that. Yeah, so what the attacker did, she used a VPN and a Tor browser and did an SSRF attack, which is a common vulnerability in some of the application servers, to get additional data from the EC2 that had a web application firewall installed on. This web application firewall had an overprivileged IAM access and could list the set of buckets that um, Capital One had. Obviously, Capital One as a bank has sensitive data in their file system, in their S3 buckets. This data included credit card data, IDs, people's personal data. And after doing the SSRF attack, the attacker could know what's the bucket name, and she also downloaded all of this data only up to a certain date. My guess and speculation is that that could have been done up to a certain date because encryption was turned on from that date forward. Um, so it's a pretty simple scenario. It could happen for everyone. Let's say I'm an engineer and I want to stand up a new EC2 instance and I just want it to work. I'm probably going to do a very generic IAM policy that probably has a star in it, or overprivileged list all my buckets privilege that grants an attacker the possibility to utilize that for bad means.
So how sophisticated of an attack would you say this is? I mean, it's one thing I think if the keys are open, you know what I mean? Like if you keep stuff unlocked on your infrastructure, and I understand that there's a risk there, but how sophisticated and how prevalent is the techniques to find this bucket? Is this a needle in a haystack kind of a thing, or what's the approach?
You know what? It's not this Stuxnet worm that was led by a government. It's a very simple attack. It's a human mistake to have a misconfigured resource. Nothing sophisticated there. I think that the main challenge of Capital One is to maintain such a large scale environment with a lot of engineers, and keeping everything tight is more of a governance issue than actually a very sophisticated threat.
It's interesting because I think at least I have the perception that the social engineering is actually the easiest way into the building, right? It's not about the locks, it's not about the technical security, it's the social engineering.
So I'm not sure that in Capital One case was were any social engineering aspect. I think that in Twitter that might have been maybe a Twitter employee got by by some reason, could be a phishing email, could have been someone that just wanted to help, um, could have leaked some credentials out that gave access to the Twitter attacker.
If I'm a DevOps or cloud admin and I want to avoid being Capital One, what kinds of techniques or what should I be thinking about to make sure my team is not susceptible to this specific attack?
I think that what you should start with is identify how big is that environment and how fast pacing it is. How many engineers do you have? How often do they push stuff into that production? And how often are those changes part of the infrastructure? Infrastructure changes can include S3 buckets, new databases, changes in security groups, encryptions, keys, etc. Up until Lambdas and Kubernetes clusters. And if it's a small environment, you can probably use the baked-in tools of the cloud provider of AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud, and get a good grasp of the current status. The nice thing that the cloud providers have done is taking common benchmarks like the CIS benchmark, SOC 2, PCI, ISO, and NIST framework, and started to map those into the native tooling of the cloud providers. So on AWS, I would start with AWS config and security hub. And it will probably be great for if you're one engineer in a small organization that has the responsibility of administrating the cloud. I think that it gets more complex as you have more and more environments, more and more AWS accounts, for example, and larger team, because each team is working on a different pace, on different resources, and it's really hard to keep up for a small DevOps team versus a ton of application developers running various apps in the cloud.
So on that, you talked about some of these compliance and design things and baking that into the process. Is this something that really has to be managed from a central team, or is there like some open source tools I can use? I know that you've worked in open source a little bit. Are there some open source tools that could be used for this, or is this something that I really have to use from the cloud providers, or what's up with that?
Yeah, so it's an evolving market of open source tools. What it started as, hey, we have a security issue, let's distribute it into a Slack channel. And then people will jump on Slack. But if you have like tons of resources and tons of changes, you get this endless channel of messages that you just can't track on. So I actually encountered these specific issues maintaining various AWS environments. And what I try to understand is, can I catch these issues really earlier in the process? And I try to understand how application developers deploy their application to their cloud. And what I saw in various teams is that some of them are using CloudFormations, Docker, obviously, Terraform, Kubernetes YAMLs, serverless framework manifests, all kind of those stuff. And it would have been, well, on my previous role, I was a software architect at RSA, which was part of the Dell Technologies. And in my previous role, it was like an endless chase of an architect versus a tons of engineers pushing changes to production. And it's an endless code review process. And on the other hand, there is the security team that is always pushing those Slack messages and Jira tickets of, hey, there is a security issue with this resource in the cloud. You should really solve it. So what I decided to do is to develop a new open source tool that will catch this specific issue while a developer is developing in Terraform, for example. So the goal is, while you write your code, before you're committing it using a pre-commit hook, it will tell you, hey, you have this new S3 bucket you defined in Terraform. You need to put encryption on.
Now, I hate to put you on the spot, but do you think I could see it? Do you think you could show me your open source tool? What do you think?
Yeah, sure. We can make it happen. Let me put it out. What I'm running on, I have a training project named TerraGoat that has a vulnerable by design infrastructure code, which resembles a lot of infrastructure environments that I've seen. And the second tool is the guidance tool that will help me to catch those issues while I'm developing. So let's take a look on the environment that I have here. So I have some AWS directory, Azure, GCP. What I'm going to do is to take a look on the AWS directory, and let's take a look on my EC2 instance Terraform, all right? So it's a pretty standard Terraform code. It's an AWS instance, a web host. Can you identify something wrong with it, by the way? It has plain text access keys to an AWS environment, which could have been what happened in Capital One. So what I am going to do is I'm going to start scanning. I'm going to install my little helper called Checkov. After doing that, I'm going to scan Checkov with Checkov the TerraGoat project using the -d, which means minus directory. And I'm going to scan the AWS directory and see the results. So I have quite a lot of issues here. Let's start going through those. So here's the issue of having hard-coded access keys. Let me make the screen a little larger.
So ideally, you could, I'm sorry to jump ahead, but you could take this tool and stick it into your CI/CD process, for example, right, and catch this but on check-in.
Yeah, so it has a GitHub Action integration, GitLab pipeline, Bitbucket pipes, Circle CI, Jenkins. You can use it whenever, and it will just fail the build when a developer is pushing a pull request on a new infrastructure change. So stuff like open SSH port to the world would not exist in your public cloud before they are provisioned.
Very nice. And that's available on GitHub, or what's the licensing status of that? Is that some sort of open core thing, or what?
So it's under the Apache 2 license. You can search for Checkov in GitHub and download it. It has a Docker, a homebrew. Feel free to use it.
If you were to recommend like one or two things that like every DevOps team or every DevSecOps team should think about with regard to this specific kind of attack, what would you recommend people do at a kind of a practical, what can I do today, I guess?
Yeah, so I would recommend two actions. One, make sure you have a runtime detection engine on your production environment. That can be the native tools or open source tools like Prowler, which is very good, just to have a good coverage of what is currently running. And the second is use a tool like Checkov or Open Policy Agent or others to statically analyze your infrastructure code and make sure that you don't have new issues in your pipeline before they are provisioned to the production. Your goal is just to keep the bar at a certain level and not go above it with new infrastructure issues. And over time, to get it much lower.
I want to ask you, you're in the security area. I work a bit in reliability, and I think that there's an interesting topic, which is technical debt. Okay, I wanted to get your experience on this because I'm sure you've had to wrestle with technical debt before. And in some ways, security fixes also represent technical debt at some level, right? They're not features. It's not stuff that is going to necessarily make a product manager happy or make your CEO happy, right? To deliver these things, they might get upset when it doesn't work, but it's something you have to be kind of constantly vigilant about. What's your approach or sort of strategy for dealing with the balance between do I work on features or does my team fix all the sort of technical debt that's accruing to make my service work?
So I think that none of the two options are very healthy. Working only on feature or only on technical debt can be very destructive to your organization. So the way that we internally try as an engineering team to fix that is to back it up with data. For example, let's say that I have this feature that is on production and it has technical debt. Should I right away fix it? Not yet. I need to know how well does it scale with the current status? Are there any critical flaws in it? Is it hard to maintain and I have lack of knowledge in my engineering team due to someone that had left or changed position? If the answer to all of those is no, you probably shouldn't touch it yet.
What are the kind of metrics and what are the kinds of goals and thresholds and who decides what that data means? Who interprets the data? How do you approach that problem?
Let's say that I have this web server that gets a lot of traffic and it's been there for the past year or 2 or 3 or more. Should I deprecate it? Is it time to move to a serverless option of it or to change the web server to CloudFront with some Docker containers? The main metric I would look like is how much traffic this web server gets before making any kind of decision. If it's one message a day, really an EC2 is a good solution.
Before you even look at how well it's serving, the first question you would ask is how much volume is it even serving before you even ask how well it's doing?
So I am assuming that if it's there for a few years, it's doing the functionality as a feature as it should. If it's not, there is like a feature bug and not a technical debt, that product manager would probably say, hey, customers are getting mad. You should really solve this issue. But assuming that's not the case, I will look for usage metrics. And also not only usage metrics, but also code usage metrics. How often is this code being maintained? If it's really often, but not too much often, it means that someone knows the shit that is going on there. If it's too often, it means that there is too many issues there that someone is chasing.
I want to drill into this a little bit because I think you made a very interesting assumption, and I want to challenge your assumption a little bit, right? That the product manager or the stakeholders of it would be aware that this web server, this lonely web server that's been sitting there for a few years, is actually doing its job well. I mean, it is possible that it's succeeding on retry. It's possible that it's failing silently and in a way that's unknown. It's possible that it's failing and being redirected to some other service that's picking up the slack, if you know what I'm saying, or that there's degraded results of some sort. It really depends. And the idea that the product manager knows what's going on based on the data or based on customer feedback, how realistic is that in your experience, and how can we make that better? What do you think about that?
So it's funny. As a DevOps engineer, I'm making the assumption that you have all of the monitoring in place and you have this Grafana dashboard and Kibana dashboard that gives you that visibility, and nothing is really not standing out there. But if you don't have those, if you don't have the data, you should really start by collecting some, both on your production monitoring and on your CI/CD pipeline. Like, it's really important to know what's happening on the provision services and application, and also what's happening with your team. Like, have the Jira metrics in place and make sure that they're working both on something that is interesting for them and educating so they can develop over time, and also on stuff that are important to customers and stuff that helps the organization scale.
When you talk about what's important to customers, how would you go about, maybe there's some you have some thoughts, I have my own thoughts on this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, about how do I actually take those monitoring metrics that are in my Kibana or Grafana dashboard and ensure that they're actually meaningful, that I'm not, introducing data biases, or looking at the data in a way that doesn't tell me very much about customers due to data issues, or just a lack of refinement in the data in those dashboards. How do you go about making sure that the data is meaningful?
That's a great question, Kid. What we try to do is always add context to the log. So let's imagine this web server again, and let's assume that it has some kind of authentication mechanism with it. It is important to add to every log the context of the request. For example, who's the user that is asking for it? To what customer environment does this user belong, assuming that's a multi-tenant server? How fast did the response came back? Was there any errors? What was the customer impact? If you're showing with a metric, hey, this customer, which is a huge provider of communication, for example, have this amount of errors, while another category of customers are having zero. You're saying, hey, is this category of my customers in my tenants important to me? We should really solve this issue. It's really important to make a good case of using the engineer's time to solve this issue. If it's a customer that you're going to say goodbye to, and in some cases this is the situation, because your company changed focus, you need to back it up by data.
I want to thank you so much, Barak. It was a pleasure chatting with you, and thank you for walking us through the Capital One outage and your open source tool. I learned a lot. It was great. Thanks for being here.
All right, thank you, Kid.
And everybody out there, this is Kip Merker from Noble Mind signing off.